So this is Buddhism in a Nutshell, which is an introductory course to Buddhism, sort of covers all of Buddhism. And it has 4 sessions. And at this point in time, we've had the first 2 sessions. So this is the 3rd class out of 4. So we have this class and we have 1 more class a week from today. And then that will be the end of the course. So we cover a lot of ground very quickly. Although it's quite, so anyway, I've gotten a little bit bogged down and I'm going a little slower than I had anticipated. But it is funny, I've always found in the many courses that I've taken over the years that the very best parts of all the courses are when the teacher gets diverted off the topic. Because that's when the teacher always says the most interesting things and where I've always learned the most. So I don't mind, so based on that experience, I don't mind getting diverted. I don't know if my diversions are as helpful as other people I've had, but anyway, I think it's a good thing. So questions, and especially I think the beginning parts are more important than the complicated parts. I mean, you can always get advanced courses in all of the complicated
exactly.
parts.
Yeah. And I think for me, I will say that I think everyone has I have a quote that was gorgeous written to me from a friend. She said she checked the world population clock, and she said, as of 5 o'clock tonight, there are almost 8 million pathways to 8 billion pathways to enlightenment.
Wow.
And I thought that was brilliant. And that's and so I appreciate that you give your personal input. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that's important because it's important that people see that people actually live their lives this way, and that's not just some abstract philosophy or something like that. Okay, so here we are, and I just want to, before we begin, because I just want to give one little clarification before we begin, and that's because I've been talking about how important experience is in Buddhism. That is really important that you experience Buddhism and that you learn to sort of trust your experiences and really, so Buddhism isn't about being in your head, about being a philosophy. It's really about living your life and really experiencing the teachings by going out and doing them, by actually practicing them and gaining experience. However, there is one small thing that you have to just be aware of when you do that, and that is that oftentimes we misinterpret our experiences, and so sometimes people really go off the track for this reason. One example would be if you do meditations, it's very well known that at deep levels of meditations, you achieve these very blissful states. And the deeper in meditation you go, the more blissful the states are, and people talk about how amazing this is. In fact, the Buddha used to say that at the deepest levels, it's as close as you could get to a nirvana or enlightenment on earth. So these things are amazing. However, one example is people often, and it's very common, they misinterpret this as saying, oh, this is so blissful, I must be enlightened. So, and they aren't, of course. They're just experiencing some of the bliss of deep meditations. And so if you don't have an experienced teacher or other person that who can sort of tell you, oh, you're not enlightened, this is just normal part of meditation, you can easily get fooled. And the other reason, there's actually a more profound reason why one has to be a little bit careful about interpreting our experiences. And that's because something I'm going to talk about just in a few minutes is that we tend to distort all of our ways of looking at the world because we're so egocentric. So we always look at everything through the lens of, is this good for me or is this bad for me? And because of that, there's a strong tendency to, look favorably on things we like and to look unfavorably on things that we dislike. And so by doing that, that often will cause us to misinterpret our experiences, to distort them because of this egocentricity that we have. And this is, and this egocentricity is from what I'm going to talk about as our delusions, the kleshas. And so we always have to be aware of that. And in fact, when Buddha was living and he was running around giving all of these different teachings, he actually very strongly suggested that people not have strong opinions about things, or at least not voice strong opinions, because it often leads to divisiveness. I know this and I'm smarter than you, and this is the correct way and you're wrong, and so forth. And in fact, the monks that were surrounding Buddha were often getting in fights for that reason. One monk looking down at another, thinking that he knew Buddhism and Dharma better, and so forth. And what the Buddha really seemed to suggest is that most of our views really sort of come from prejudice. They're not really about truth or falsity. They're more about prejudice. They're more about what we like, what enhances our feeling of egocentricity, and we dislike opinions that we don't like. So usually strong opinions have more to do with our own internal prejudice or egocentricity than they do with any attempt at really finding truth or falsity. And so it's always good to just be aware of that and to just be open, And I think one way that I always think about this, being a physicist and a scientist, I always look at all of my opinions as provisional. So it's more like, based on what I know so far, this is what I think is most likely to be true. And if new facts come to light, or if I get more information, maybe I'll change my mind. So I never, in my mind, try to stand very hard in any sort of opinion. And I think the other reason too is, of course, the world is a very complex world, and there's so many things that are going on. And most opinions tend to simplify things. It's like, we feel strongly about this, saying only this can be true. But when we're saying only this can be true, we're leaving aside all of the myriad of complications that are sort of present in any situation. So I'm always sort of very cautious and skeptical about things. And it's also the same way about the spiritual path. So when people say, oh, you absolutely have to do this, or terrible things will happen, I never really believe it. I feel that the spiritual path is a very broad path, and that each of us live in our own very complex environment, and what may be good for one person may not be helpful for another. So I tend to take a very sort of broad, universal view of things and try to look at things very broadly. There is also another aspect which comes up, which is even going perhaps a little bit deeper. And there is this notion in Buddhism that at the early stages of our spiritual life, a lot of us have a lot of negativities in our mind. And so this comes under the heading, sometimes they talk about this in terms of purification. So they talk about purifying sort of the negative parts of our mind. And they say that a Buddha, or a completely enlightened being, is a perfect being that has none of these negativities or kleshas or obstructions. And they say that actually that these obstructions have a second function, which is quite interesting. They say that this other functions of these kleshas, or distortions, distorted ways, or things like greed, anger, delusion, that what these things do is they actually obstruct our understanding. And because of these delusions or negativities, these kleshas, it's hard for us to see the world the way it really is. The world always comes through in this sort of distorted way. And so they say that to achieve really deep understanding of our world, it's important to advance higher on the spiritual path. And as you advance higher, you purify yourself of these obstructions or negativities. And over time, eventually you see the world clearer and you see things more correctly. I think it's just worthwhile to, and in fact, sometimes this comes, especially Mahayana Buddhism, which I'm going to explain later today probably, comes up very heavily. And in Mahayana Buddhists, they say that we can't even see who the real gurus are. Oftentimes, there are these people who are extraordinarily deep spiritual people who are living perhaps side by side for us. And we just see them as ordinary, non-spiritual people. And part of the reason for that is because of these obstructions, the negativities of our mind. Our mind isn't pure enough to see the deeply spiritual people as they really are, as we don't see their deep spirituality because we're obstructed by these negativities in our mind. So anyway, these are just a lot of interesting things to throw out at you for you to think about. Again, as I say, we don't have to believe anything in Buddhism, but these are things that are commonly come up in discussions, and I think it's quite interesting to think about. So I've always believed that the hardest thing in life is interpreting our experiences correctly, really understanding how it's really working, and not looking at it from some slanted or strongly emphasizing some particular aspect that distorts them. So anyway, so I think it is important to really pay deep attention to your experiences, but you should be cautious about interpreting them and be very broad-minded. And I think it's always good to be a little provisional, saying, okay, I'm doing the best I can. This is how I see things today. But maybe later, as I go deeper on the spiritual path, perhaps I'll have a deeper understanding of some of these things. So I would just leave, I think it's just helpful to put that little caution out, because it's not that, everything, if we feel something, that doesn't make something true. But our feelings are important. Our feelings sort of is our way, especially modern neurobiology talks a lot about the importance of feelings and how it sort of integrates a lot of our understanding of the world. So your feelings are important. It's very important to pay attention to your experiences, but I would just say don't overinterpret or take really strong views based on them, but try to be a little bit more open. Okay, so that's enough of that. That's just a small caution. So where we are is we started the nitty-gritty of Buddhism. We started talking about the Four Noble Truths. And as we said, the Four Noble Truths are suffering, true suffering. They often put the word true in front of these things. So they talk about true suffering, true cause, true cessation, and true path. And true suffering was the part that I talked about last week, at the end of last week. And that's the part that just our world is filled with suffering, which, doesn't take a lot of imagination. You just have to pick up the daily newspaper and look at the news, and there's just suffering galore for everybody. And not only for us, but also for animals, for every type of being. There's a lot of suffering. But as I mentioned last time, this notion of suffering, in the early days, people used to call, when Buddhism first came to the West, people would always talk about Buddhism as being the dismal science. And they meant by that is that the Buddha kept running around talking about suffering all the time. And so they said, this is really dreary. Why doesn't he talk about happy things? And of course, as I said before, this notion of suffering, dukkha, in the Sanskrit really means something a little broader than that. It means that everything in life is unsatisfactory. But nonetheless, the other thing too, okay, so maybe that's enough of that. So let me just go on here and go on to the second noble truth, which Buddha said, of course, what Buddha's whole goal in life, when we talked about his biography, was to find a way to stop suffering. And the second noble truth, meaning true cause, is sort of the key to the whole thing, because Buddha said, suffering isn't accidental. It's not just something that just pops up out of nowhere. There is actually a cause of suffering. There's a reason for suffering. And as I said, everything in Buddhism is about cause and effect, about nothing happens randomly. If you look carefully enough, there's always a cause. In fact, there's usually multiple causes operating simultaneously, because we live in a complex world, lots of things are going on simultaneously. But it is a causal universe. And so if there is suffering, it's not random. And so what Buddha, when he became enlightened, the key to this enlightenment is he understood what was the cause of our suffering. And he said that the cause of our suffering was, in Sanskrit, this word klesha, which are usually translated as afflictions or delusions. And he also said, so it's klesha and karma. However, karma is created, as we will see from these kleshas, so ultimately is these kleshas. And the reason why it's translated dually, sometimes as afflictions and sometimes as delusions, as you read various Buddhist books, is that these kleshas have sort of the nature of both of these things. They are often called afflictions because they are what ultimately leads to our suffering. And they're called delusions because they are a distorted way of looking at the world. And it's because of looking at the world through a distorted way that we do all of the negative actions that we do, which then through karmic fruition causes all of our suffering. And sometimes another thing that's often said in Buddhism is that we have no control over our minds. And so I just bring this up here because this is related to these kleshas, these delusions, afflictions. So these delusions and afflictions, another way of looking at them is really just bad habits of mind. So these are bad habits of mind that we've had since Buddhism believes in rebirth for countless eons, huge long times in the past. Sometimes these habits have been with us. However, if you want to just stay in the modern life, we know even in our ordinary present life, even if we just look at our current life, we all know that we all develop habits. Habits, in fact, habits are very helpful. They often help us do things like drive and stuff. So we can do a lot of things automatically. We develop habits and it's very helpful. But if you have a bad habit, it's not so helpful. And if you have a bad habit, it's like, quite frankly, for most of us, for most of our lives, we're on autopilot. We just run based on our habits. We just automatically do things without thinking, because it takes a lot of mental energy to think very carefully and make decisions. And most people don't like making decisions for that reason. It takes a lot of work. It's hard work to make decisions and difficult. So most of us operate on autopilot. So our habits are really strong. So in Buddhism, when they talk about our minds being out of control, what they really mean is not that we don't have, conscious willpower, or that we can't change things, or, that we don't have free will, if you like. It really is talking more about this habitual nature of our minds, that most of the time we're on autopilot. And if we're on autopilot, then we're not in control of our mind. And so in that sense, and usually because we have over time developed a lot of negativities, for some strange reason, it always seems easier to develop negativities than positivities. It always seems hard work to develop positivities, but it seems quite easy to get attracted by negative things. I don't know why that is, but nonetheless, so in Buddhism, what they say is that the way we get control over our mind is really through mindfulness, through meditation. In meditation, we can actually look in great detail at how our minds are operating, and we can begin to see how under the control of various habits we are. And once you begin to understand that, then that gives you the opportunity to slowly change those habits and become more positive, which leads to greater happiness. And in fact, I would say that in some sense, in ordinary life, moment to moment, that is the whole job of Buddhism, to constantly have a mindful mind, to be checking it, to see whether what we're doing, just look at what we're doing. Is what we're doing something positive or negative? And if it's something negative, try to stop it. And if it's something positive, try to enhance it. And if you do that, that will actually solve our problem. It will ultimately, over a long period of time, lead to complete happiness. Because if you have a positive mind, you won't create negative karma, which when that karma comes to fruition, positive karma comes to fruition in a pleasant way, in a good way, in a happy way. And negative karma comes to fruition in a negative way. So it's really, so I think that is probably the most important thing. If you can take care of your mind moment by moment and keep being very mindful, maybe doing some meditation to increase your mindfulness, you don't have to worry about enlightenment, nirvana, anything else. You will gradually, day by day, moment by moment, become a better person. And as you become a better person, that will lead you to becoming a happy person. It's quite interesting, when Buddha taught, besides talking about suffering so much, the other thing, which is very noticeable, if you read the sutras, these collections of all of the teachings he gave, he's over and over again talking about morality. And the reason for that is that it's immoral behavior, harming behavior, negative behavior, behavior that's under control of these delusions of hatred, greed, and delusion that cause us to generate all of our negativity that will lead to suffering. And the Buddha thought that this was really the paramount thing. This was the most important thing that he had to teach us. He wanted to stop our suffering. And one amazing analogy that he gave was sometimes it's called the fire sermon or the fire sutra or the fire teaching. And he gave this analogy where he said, you should imagine that your hair is on fire. And he said, if your hair is on fire, you have a real sense of urgency. You drop everything and immediately, try to put it out, find some water to dump on you, pat it down, whatever. You just drop everything and attend to that. And the Buddha used to say is that we should have that same urgency about practicing our spiritual path. Why? Because, if we just let our minds run wild and generate all of this negative karma, we're going to have suffering in the future and intense suffering in the future. And so, so what the Buddha is basically saying, if you really understand this, if you really get how the world works, you would treat your current life as though your hair were on fire. You would have that same sense of urgency. It's quite interesting because if you read biographies of deeply spiritual people, from the past eras of Buddhism, really amazing monks and so forth, the one thing that you always notice is there's nothing that they're more careful about than sort of their morality, their actions, making sure that everything that they do is positive. And that's because, of course, as deeply spiritual people, they know they can more directly see how the world works. They don't have these distortions. So
okay,
anyway,
I've got a question, Bob, if I could, at this point along this topic. One of the things, and I am doing Dr. Ross's course on dying and living, okay? Mm-hmm. And the thing that I question is this preoccupation with what feels to me like pushing the fear of death to motivate us. Whereas, okay, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but for me, it's like what I've taken in is more of an altruistic point of view. And certainly Buddhism has that with the Bodhisattva stuff. Mm-hmm. But to me, that's personally, and I kind of resist all of this emphasis on fear of death and, blah, blah. So for me, that's a much more motivating factor. I would like everybody to be happy. I would like the world to be good. And if I behave in a certain manner, that will help expedite that, is what my hope is.
Absolutely.
Rather than me being motivated by, oh gosh, I got to do the right thing, because if I don't, I'm going to suffer,
Yes. Yeah, that's true. That's true. And it's interesting, because that's why when Buddha taught, he always said that you have to teach based on the people you're teaching to.
Yeah. Okay.
And so the Buddha would always tailor his teachings and to teach things that would the critical thing for the Buddha is what is the most beneficial thing that I can tell these people who are in front of me. So he would always change his teachings to be most beneficial to the students. And the reason for that is precisely the way you are. For you, the motivation of death is not a helpful one. You prefer, what's more helpful for you is more of this altruistic way of looking at things. And that's perfectly fine. The part of the reason why probably Ross or whoever it was that was teaching emphasized death is because the Buddha himself did give teachings where Buddha said that death is like an elephant footprint. It's the deepest imprint. It often has the deepest impression on people when they think about their death. And it can be a profoundly motivating way of looking at the world. Just realizing that you're not going to live forever. Because a lot of people say, there was this thing, in the Middle Ages with the Catholic Church, where you had these people running around doing all these terrible things to make money and, greed and sex and all sorts of things. And they felt safe because they could always go to a priest at the end, get a confession, and then they'd be safe and they would go to heaven. So, for a lot of people, if you don't think about death, a lot of times you can think, well, things are going great, and then as I get older, maybe I'll become spiritual or something. So anyway, that's why I'm saying that, again, in all of the spiritual teachings, you can't be dogmatic. You can say you absolutely have to look at the spiritual path this way. But I think it's more appropriate to say that you have all of these different teachings, and all of these different teachings benefit different people in different ways. And so I would say that if the thinking about death is not helpful, then I wouldn't worry about it. It's not something that you absolutely have to do. It's like people are different. We're all in different parts of our spiritual path. But nonetheless, having said that, certainly, the fact that we will ultimately die, there's actually sort of a deeper aspect of that, which is that everything in our life is impermanent. And so another way of viewing death is that it's just the impermanence of our lives. And so if you really get that everything we do is impermanent, and if you really, in a profound way, get the fact that, yes, I am going to die someday. And after I die, I'm going to be reborn somewhere. But, all of the money that I've accumulated in this life, all of the prestige or whatever good things I have in life, it's going to just disappear as though it never existed in future lives. And so it helps you sort of de-emphasize greed, hatred, all sorts of negative attitudes. So it can be very helpful if you look at it. So if you look at death in the right way as impermanence, it can actually be very helpful. It can be a way of sort of letting go of things. A lot of times, it's really our grasping at things in life that leads almost always to all of our problems in life. And so one beauty of death meditations is that it helps you let go of things. It helps you see sort of through the superficialities of life, if you like, and sort of view life and sort of a little deeper level. I mean, I myself have a very personal reaction to the death meditation, because I was once doing a set of a retreat, sort of a mini week-long retreat. And on the very first day of the retreat, and I think it was the very last meditation, was a meditation on death, precisely in this motivational role, and I think that the phrase they use is "you may die today" or something like that. And so, and again, it was that idea of, well, you really can die today. And when you die, you won't have time to make up for any spiritual problems. So you got to do your spiritual work immediately, because you don't know, you could die tomorrow. And that very night, I got gallstone pancreatitis. A little stone fell out of my gallbladder, and I got this pancreatitis, which can kill you off. I spent a couple of weeks in the hospital, actually almost went into intensive care. So, so anyway, this meditation made a profound impact on me. Yes, you may really die tonight. So I don't know if that's helpful.
It is. And can I say, that was good timing in terms of the meditation on death. And I have to say, I've had a profound experience of change recently. I hadn't been photographed for a long time, right? I don't really intensely look at myself in the mirror, but I saw this photograph and it was like, wow, the aging that process is so dramatic. And of course, and I'm aware my internal vision is, I still see myself visually as 20.
Yes.
But you can see the changes. And I thought, yep, here we go. You've got it,
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. It's like we often, we always have a tendency to look at the world as permanent, as ourselves never changing, and that is a mistake. And and so we need little things to help remind us, because in a sense, that's Buddha's most profound teaching. Everything is impermanent. And I know what you mean about looking at yourself. I mean, my mother died when she was just a few weeks short of 100. And she always said that she always saw herself as sort of a young woman. And she was always astonished that she was so old. So yes, yeah, no, this notion of impermanence is really important. So anyway, let me switch on and keep going now. So as I said before, I mean, and the thing about this notion of these kleshas, the cause of suffering, and again, we need to talk a little bit about karma also. And in Buddhism, there is a sense that we are reborn. And so we are always born, we go through a life, we die, and then we're reborn. And in Buddhism, there can be different realms, which I will talk about, that you can be reborn as. But what they say in Buddhism is that the only thing that continues on to your next life is really your karma. So, who you are in this life, your personality and so forth, it's all based on the experiences of this life. And when we die, there seems to be this great forgetting. We forget about this life. So when we're reborn into our next life, it's very rare. I mean, sometimes it happens that people can remember former lives, but most of the time we forget about it. And so in our next life, we have new experiences, and the personality and sort of who we are based on the experiences of that life. So it's not as though, our current, the person who we think we are now just moves across to the next life. That's not what happens. What happens is there's a continuity of consciousness that moves across. So it's said that the words that are used is that we have a mental continuum. And it's believed in Buddhism that each moment of consciousness is like the blink of an eye. And that actually it's our consciousness is constantly changing moment by moment. And so it's almost like we're a new person each moment. However, there is, like I say, a continuity. There's a continuousness to all of life, actually, and all of our world. And so we tend to have this, so we continue to have the same karma, we have the same tendencies. And so there is this continuity to our mental consciousness. But when we die, instead of blink, the next moment being the next moment of our life, it's like blink, the next moment is we're in a different life. So I think that's the way to view it. And of course, so I think it's very, very helpful to just realize that, you know, it's mainly the karma, the continuity of our karma that continues on to the next life. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about karma now. So the usual sort of symbolism that they use for karma, that most people use, is they talk about karmic seeds. So what they're saying is that each action that we do plants a karmic seed. And those karmic seeds that we plant can be positive, negative, or neutral. And if they are positive, then when they ripen, which is the other terminology that's used, when they come to fruition, they will result. So positive karma results in positive results, good, pleasurable, pleasant, happy. Negative karma results in negative results, things that are unhappy, painful, and so forth. And neutral karma is just neutral. And it's said that, and again, in the Buddhist way of looking at things, karma is ultimately created by our intention. It's our intention to either be positive, beneficial, non-harming, which creates positive karma, or we can have minds that are negative, harming, causing injury and so forth, the wish to harm. And those result in future pain or suffering when those things. And then other things like just that, which are neither, of course, which is probably most of our karma, just results in neutral things. So that's how karma is created. It's mainly created by intention. Of course, if we follow through, then that can make the karma more intense and can result in, stronger ripening, if you like. For example, if you develop this intention that you really hate somebody and you wish to kill them, that intention of wishing to harm that person creates negative karma. However, if you don't do anything about it, then it just remains at that level. However, if you actually follow through and actually really do kill that person, then that karmic result is much more intense and much stronger. Okay, and it's said that we store up all of these karmic seeds in our mental continuum, and then the other tricky thing, of course, is that this notion of karma ripening. So you can ask, so at every moment of our life, we're continually creating karma. So you can ask, when does all of that karma ripen? And it ripens due to, like everything else in Buddhism, cause and effect. When the causes and conditions are appropriate for that karma to ripen, it will ripen. And the other aspect of karma, though, which is really, I think, critically important, and in fact, the Buddha said that, without realizing this, nothing would work, actually. So the thing that's important to realize about karma, though, is that the way karma ripens is not one-to-one. So it's not as though, I kill somebody, so the way that karma ripens is somebody kills me. It's not that sort of direct one-to-one thing. So the way that karma ripens depends very heavily on the type of person you are when it ripens. So if you are a deeply spiritual person, trying to do a lot of beneficial things, and you have a lot of positivity in your mind, let's say, 20 lifetimes ago, you killed somebody, perhaps that karma will be triggered by something, will ripen. But when it's triggered and ripen, it won't be ripen as though you being killed, but probably in some, less awful way. Maybe you'll have a headache, or maybe you'll have some sort of illness or something like that. Or maybe your life will be, shorter by a few weeks or something like that. So it can ripen in different ways. And so it's important to realize that, so that's why it's so important to live the spiritual life. So it's not only because of the karmic causes that you're creating for the future, so that when you're leading the spiritual life, you're a better person right now, and you're creating more positive karma and less negativity. But it's also because it also affects, how all this previous karma ripens as well. So it's what Buddha really said ultimately is, he says, karma is so complex that none of you guys are ever going to understand it. The only person who can understand all the complexities of karma is actually a Buddha. And in fact, while Buddha was alive, whenever anybody who was well known died, they would immediately come to him and say, oh, what happened to this guy? Where was he reborn? And the Buddha would tell him, he could be reborn in a godlike realm, or a worse place, or as a human. And so the Buddha actually could actually understand. The Buddha could directly see what was happening to people. Okay, so what is negativities and positivities in karma generation? So it's basically, as I said, I think the easiest way to think about it is any sort of harming of yourself or others is negative, and any sort of non-harming or trying to be beneficial is positive. And in terms of karma generation, all the details of the situation matter. And what matters most of all is your intention. So sometimes people do actions that on the surface look negative or bad, or like they're harming somebody. But sometimes the intention behind this is people trying to do the best they can to help people. And so that changes the whole situation completely. And so even though we have what are sort of, there are sort of 10 moral rules. So it sort of reminds me of the 10 Commandments and Christianity and Judaism. But so the standard 10 negative non-virtues are non-virtues of body, mainly killing, stealing, or sexual misconduct, where you're either by killing, you're physically harming somebody, stealing, you're harming somebody by taking their possessions, sexual misconduct, where you're harming somebody through your sexual conduct. And the non-virtuous actions of speech are lying, divisive speech, hurtful speech. And the last one's a little trickier, idle chatter. I think it's more like rumor mongering, or probably something like that, which ultimately turns very negative. And the non-virtuous actions of mind are covetousness, malice, holding wrong views. And the 10 virtuous actions are just the inversion of that, the opposites. Okay, so why do we create negative or positive actions? Well, the reason why we, again, as I said before, that we create negative actions is because of these afflictions or delusions. And what the Buddha said is he said that we have underlying tendencies toward these afflictions, delusions, called anusayas. And these underlying tendencies tend to be such that whenever we meet with an appropriate situation, these afflictions, delusions, these kleshas sort of automatically arise. And when they arise, there's a tendency to do negative actions. And the reason we do negative actions is because we're looking at the world as this, in a distorted way. We look at it and we think, oh, this looks good to me. Whereas in reality, if we could see the world as it really was, we would realize, oh, this is a terrible thing to do. But because of our delusions, our distorted ways of looking at things, we often do a lot of things that we mistakenly think are good, but they're not really good. So traditionally in Buddhism, there's large numbers of these delusions and afflictions that are cataloged. mainly basically cataloged on whether the Buddha talked about them in any of his sutras, his teachings or not. So there's, but they're usually sort of layered, if you like. So it says that there is one fundamental klesha, which is the root klesha, which is ignorance, really ignorance of the way the world really works. So that is the root klesha. And from that develops the three main delusions, which are attachment or greed, anger, and delusion. And then from those, that spins off into six, which are delusion, attachment, or greed, anger, pride, afflicted doubt, and afflicted view, which some of these have to be explained, which I won't do here. And then from that, other things like resentment, spite, jealousy, miserliness, and so forth. So anyway, that's sort of all of these delusions. And in Buddhism, it is said that there are antidotes to all of these. So there are ways of correcting these. And that's what the antidote. So you can think about it again from this medical analogy. The delusions and afflictions are like the bacteria that cause disease. And the antidotes are like the medicine you take that wipe out the bacteria. And so there's huge numbers of teaching in Buddhism where they teach you, for example, how to deal with anger or with, greed or any of these other things. There are specific ways of actually learning how to control these, to sort of stop yourself from going there. A lot of these antidotes really involve sort of better ways of looking at the thing. For example, impermanence is an important thing. So if you have all this greed, if you really realize impermanence, you realize, oh, you can't hang on to anything. It's like as soon as you possess something, because all situations are impermanent, sooner or later you'll have to give it up. You can't hang on to it forever. So it's just not as valuable if you can't have it forever. Because whenever we want something, we sort of really want it forever. So in similar ways, again, some common antidotes is the antidote for hatred is actually love. And sometimes it's just understanding things like when we hate people, we have a distorted point of view. And where that distorted point of view is that we focus on all the bad things we don't like about that person, which enhances all of our anger and hatred. Whereas if we can learn to take a more balanced point of view at that person, saying that that person also has good qualities and there are reasons, and that person probably has friends and people that love that person, it helps us sort of temper down or reduce that anger or hatred that we feel. So anyway, a lot of Buddhism is about these, understanding these kleshas and understanding the antidotes or ways of doing it. And of course, the best antidote is always meditation. Okay, so that's enough on the cause. But anyway, here's again, the logic of the whole thing. So I have the suffering, there's a cause of suffering. So once you realize that, you get this idea, well, if there's a cause of suffering and I really want to get rid of suffering, what do I need to do? Well, I need to eliminate the cause. And if it were possible to eliminate the cause, then I could be free of suffering. And so that's what Buddha's big insight is he realized that it is possible to remove the causes of suffering and therefore be forever free of suffering. And when you're eternally free of suffering, that's what we call nirvana or enlightenment. And that's what takes us out of this samsaric world that we're in. So the third noble truth is exactly this. The truth is a cessation of suffering. And what Buddha always said is I know you can cease these afflictions and delusions and become a perfectly pure being because I've done it. And if you do exactly the things that I've done, you will become purified meaning removing these negativities of your mind, these bad habits of your mind. You know, if you follow the same path I did, you'll get the same result. You know, I was once a person just like you, but I did the correct path to remove these things. So that's the message of the true cessation, that we can be completely cured. It is possible, and the Buddha knew it because he did it. So this is the point where I think it's also helpful to talk about this notion of samsara a little more deeply. So basically, Buddha said that the world we're in is called samsara. And this samsara includes not just our present life, but the whole cycle of countless lifetimes. Buddha always said that he could never see a beginning to our lives. That if you go back as far as you can, there will always have been previous lives. And so this cycle of existence, where we continually cycle through life after life after life, is called samsara. And the Buddha said that there are different realms of samsara. And again, these are things that, again, you don't have to believe anything in Buddhism, but this was what the Buddha said. And the Buddha always said, he said, these things I'm telling you are not things that are just some theory that somebody told to me. These are things that I've directly experienced myself and directly seen myself. And as the Buddha became enlightened, he achieved the ability to see all of his previous lives. So the Buddha saw going back forever. He knew who he was, what kind of life he lived, what realm he was in, what his experiences of that life was. He directly knew all of these things. And in fact, he often gave other teachings which aren't normally included in the sutras. There are teachings called the Jataka Tales, which is where the Buddhists recorded a lot of these stories, where he would talk about his previous lives. And he would often use his previous lives to demonstrate some aspect of Dharma or the teachings or some aspect of morality. And so he would often give teachings about who he was in his former lives. And the Buddha said that there were these 6 realms and that he knew this from direct experience of his previous lives. So usually I'm actually going to simplify it and just make it. Sometimes we talk about 6 realms. So, but I think it's easier to think about it in terms of 5 realms, because one of the realms, I don't know, is a little bit harder to understand. It was never, in my mind, explained all that carefully. But the highest realm is a godlike realm. So there are heavens. In fact, not just one heaven, but I don't know, maybe 40 different levels of heaven. So various levels of godlike realm, and the higher levels of godlike realms are even more blissful than the lower ones and have longer lifetimes. However, the difference between Christianity and this is that all of these realms are impermanent. Like, these are part of samsara. So when you are in these godlike realms, you are still in samsara, which means that they're impermanent. And eventually, even though the lifetimes may be enormously long, eventually it will come to an end and you will fall down to lower levels again. And the reason why you will fall down to lower levels is, again, there's cause and effect of everything in Buddhism. The cause for achieving these high godlike realms is you created enormous positive karma. And that's what launched you into these higher realms. And as you're enjoying yourself in these higher realms, enjoying all the bliss and pleasure, you're burning up this positive karma, and then you run out, and then you fall down to lower realms again. So anyway, that's the way the God realms work. And actually, there are sutras where the Buddha talks about actually going to these God realms while he was alive and interacting with various people at these godlike realms. And he also talks about being here on earth and having various of these various God beings, these various deities visit him and actually talk to him, usually during the nights. So at any rate, and not only the Buddha, but in some of the stories that the Buddha told about, some of his closest companions would also, who were liberated from samsara, sort of what we would in the Mahayanas would call small enlightenment, would actually go along with Buddha and actually also interact with these deities. So anyway, that's, again, these are things that you don't have to believe, but this is just what was taught. So there is a godlike realm. There's a sort of semi-god realm, but this little, so that's the one I'm going to skip over because there's just not enough time to explain. And then the next highest realm of if you're in the 6th divisions, the 3rd highest realm, which is the lowest of the positive things, is the human realm, what we're in. So, and it's said that the realm that we are in, the human realm, is actually the best for spiritual practice, because to do spiritual practice, it actually is helpful to have a little suffering to motivate you. And it's said that in the human realm, we have enough suffering to motivate us, but we have clear mental faculties and so forth. So we have the ability to do great spiritual work. Whereas in the God realms, there were some beings, which the Buddha would talk about, who still were doing spiritual work and still were advancing spiritually. But more often in the godlike realms, it's just such a pleasant thing. Everybody just running around enjoying themselves. They sort of forget about doing any spiritual practice. And some of these in the godlike realms, there are conversations where the people don't even remember that their lifetime is finite. They sort of think that they're in the godlike realms forever. They forget that they have a lifetime. And sometimes the Buddha has gone up to them and told them, he said, you think that the world is eternal because you think that you're living an eternal life, but actually, this is how long you're going to live. Because the Buddha knew. So anyway, so that's the human realm. And then the lower realms, there's 3 lower realms. The only one we can see directly in our present experience is the animal realm. And we see how animals often suffer horribly. They're eaten by aggressive animals. We slaughter them for food. I mean, there are some animals that actually have wonderful existence. Some of our pets seem to be like almost in a godlike realm. We take care of them so well. And actually, that's useful to know about all of these realms. In all of these realms, there's a whole range of experiences, positive and negative, because karma doesn't just ripen into throwing you. We said that we have throwing karma. At the end of our life, there is some kind of throwing karma, which propels us into one of these 6 realms. But the other aspect of karma, sometimes called environmental effects, in that the way we experience life in those realms is other karma ripening, or maybe the same karma ripening. So maybe, so you might kill somebody, but because of other positive karma you have, it may push you into a human life. But when that karma of killing from the previous life ripens, part of the form that it may take in ripening is maybe shortening your life. Maybe you'll live in slums or in horrible conditions. Maybe a lot of people will be vicious and treat you horribly and so forth, ways like that. So there's all of these different ways, different aspects of how karma ripens. So it's quite complex and, sort of more than I can probably do in this short course. But anyway, there is the animal realm. There's a realm called hungry ghosts or hungry spirits, where you're constantly trying to get food and water and you can't. It's almost like, Tantalus, you reach up for the grapes and they disappear, and you reach down to drink from a river and the water dries up and so forth. So it's just like there's terrible suffering, thirst, and usually what creates beings in this realm is tremendous greed. Huge amounts of greed will often have the karmic influence to throw you into this regime. And then the lowest realm, of course, are the hell-like realms where there's immense suffering. And there's all the vividness of the Christian hells, boiling pots of oil and being burned and all of these just horrendous things, which the Buddha at various times described in great detail. So anyway, those are the 6 realms that the Buddha talked about. But the key idea, though, is really the thing to get is this notion of the cyclic nature of this. So nothing is permanent. So even if you go into hell realm, you're not there forever. You're there because you did this negative karma. And when you burn up this negative karma, you'll rise to higher levels. And so all of us are constantly cycling up and down through all of these various karmic levels as we create positive or negative karma, suffer the results, and it gets used up in these various realms and so forth. And so the image I have, this is like a little chipmunk or something, a little cage where you're just spinning round and round and round. And that's the notion of samsara. It is cyclic. It's just spinning around and around, never really getting anywhere. And as long as you're in samsara, you're never safe, because you never know when some negative karma is going to ripen and throw you into one realm or another, or when some positive karma will throw you in a positive realm. We just don't know how the types and the nature of the karma that we've stored up from past lives. And so there's this huge uncertainty. And so that's part of the negativity of our life, is actually that uncertainty. You can never depend on anything. Even though you may be extremely wealthy today, it's like the stock market crash in 1929. You can't, there's always the possibility that something horrible will happen and you lose all your money. The stock market will crash, or maybe you'll be arrested and thrown in prison, or maybe you'll have a heart attack and die and be born as a very poor person in whatever next realm you're born into. So that is the key thing about Buddhism, is this notion of uncertainty. And so that's why the spiritual life is so important, because the spiritual life is basically, so as long as you're in samsara, there is no perfect happiness, because there's always uncertainty. That even if you've got some small amount of pleasure or wealth or whatever, it can disappear the next moment. But the one thing that is positive is that when you create this positive karma, it makes you happy. And it makes you happy in the moment. It's deeply satisfying. And as you advance to higher levels of the spiritual life, it makes you happier and happier. And so in my mind, we do have all these realms and all of this karma and stuff going on. But I think that the most important thing is just don't worry about it. Focus on becoming a better person moment by moment, living a good life now. And if you do that, in the long run, it's all going to work out. Because as you generate positive karma, that positive karma not only provides more pleasurable occurrences when it ripens, it also does other beneficial good things. And the one important, really good beneficial thing it does is it creates, it often ripens as spiritual realizations. It ripens in your advancing more rapidly through the spiritual life and developing your spiritual life at a more rapid rate. There was one Buddhist nun I know who used to travel a fair amount. And at one point, she noticed that all of a sudden, even though she didn't have the frequent flyer miles necessary, they kept upgrading her to first class or business class or something like that. She kept getting all these upgrades all the time. And she thought, wow, this is really strange. But then eventually what had occurred to her is, this is just positive karma ripening. And actually, this is not a good thing. because I'm wasting all of my positive karma on good airplane seats. And that doesn't really matter. You know, they're over in the blink of an eye. It doesn't matter. I want my positive karma to ripen in spiritual development, advancing in my spiritual life. And so she made prayers, requests to the Buddhas to stop doing this because she didn't want to waste her positive karma. So I think that's sort of an interesting way of looking at things. And I think also there is, in my mind, it is sort of a snowball effect, because what you're really trying to do is, instead of creating negative habits of mind, you're trying to create positive habits of mind. And if you keep creating positive habits of mind, the possibility of progressing faster and faster in the spiritual life begins to become possible, because it becomes easier and easier to practice positivity, because you have habits that are enhancing that positivity. And so I think actually a practical goal in life is really just to focus on that. Focus, try to have this sort of mindfulness where you're aware of what you're doing, and try to slowly over time eliminate your negative bad habits. And it will take time, because habits tend to persist, and it takes time to dampen them out. But if you keep persistently working at them, you can dampen them out. And in the same way, try to create good habits and keep reinforcing those, and use meditation and tools like that to enhance your mindfulness. And, go to teachings to generate your enthusiasm for practice and so forth. And if you keep doing things like that, you don't have to worry about the future. Your future will only get better and better. And like I say, if you're trying to be a really good person, it also has really enormous effects on how these various karmic seeds ripen. They will ripen in far easier, less horrible ways. And so I think that's the right way to do it. And it is interesting too, because the other aspect is that it is possible to use all of your experiences to progress on the spiritual life. So everybody keeps focusing on, okay, I only want positive things. I only want positive karma to ripen. I only want good things to happen to me. And while that is nice, and we do want that, it doesn't mean that the negative things or the difficult things that happen to us aren't useful. At the higher levels of spiritual life, people eventually figure out that you can use everything that happens to you to advance your spiritual life. Even bad things that happen can be enormously helpful. There are some monks and nuns I know who even pray to get cancer and other terrible diseases, because they realize that when they go through those types of suffering, that's when they can make, by being patient, being able to handle that in a good way, that will actually enable them to advance even faster in the spiritual life, so that they will ultimately, everything will turn more pleasant and positive. So there are Mahayana practices, which we will talk about that same thing, that they also talk about what they call mind training aspects of Mahayana Buddhism, special techniques for how to use all of your negative aspects in a positive way that actually enhance your spiritual practice. And I myself went through this once, because when I got this gallstone pancreatitis, being in the middle of a retreat, I was really primed for spiritual practice. And so all throughout my hospital stay, I had two main spiritual practices. The first was patient acceptance of my condition. And it's said that if you have patient acceptance, you burn up whatever negative karma created that situation. And patient acceptance by itself generates enormous merit. So I practiced patient acceptance, trying to keep my mind calm and undisturbed. I didn't get upset about the fact that this is a painful condition. I was taking drugs 80 times more powerful than morphine, and they weren't beginning to touch the pain. So pancreatitis is a very painful condition. But I sort of feel like it was a very helpful thing to me, because I think having this pancreatitis enabled me to burn up enormous amounts of negative karma in a way that was possible, which if they had ripened in some other conditions would have been truly horrible. So I was able to get rid of a huge amount of negative karma by practicing patient acceptance. And then by practicing this mind training, which I will explain probably in the next class, you can, that is even really amazingly powerful for generating positive karma. It was said that you could even, when it was first developed, people were curing leprosy with this technique. So anyway, so again, that's also part of Buddhism is, learning how to deal with the negative things while constantly enhancing the positive. And the ultimate goal is nirvana or eternal bliss, where you escape the samsaric thing, where essentially you're never again reborn in any of these realms in samsara. And so let me talk a little bit about that between there. There is different types of enlightenment, which can cause a lot of confusion. Because again, I said there's different types of Buddhism. There's the Theravadan Buddhisms, which the Mahayana sometimes look down their nose and call Hinayana lesser, which the Dalai Lama, I think, is trying to get away from that. And then there's the Mahayana. And so based on this, there's actually two different types. Well, one can go further, but there's at least two different types of nirvana or enlightenment. Sometimes they call it a small enlightenment. Sometimes they call it a great enlightenment. So the small enlightenment is the standard Hinayana thing where you're liberated from samsara. And you become what's known as an arhat or an arahant, depending on whether you're in Pali or Sanskrit. And when you do that, then that is a form of enlightenment. And you are a completely pure being and you have eternal bliss in nirvana. The other one, which the Mahayanas talk about, which again, I will come and talk about the Mahayanas, is they talk about in that one, you become an actual Buddha. And so, which is an even higher state than the perfectly pure arhat or arhat. And that's a little bit tricky to explain, but it was known even at the time of Buddha. It was known that Buddha had certain abilities, omniscience, knowledge, abilities that were much higher than the people who had only become liberated from samsara. So it's clear that a Buddha, as the Buddha originally was a higher state than just being liberated from samsara. So that higher state of full Buddhahood, sometimes they call great enlightenment. And in the Mahayana path, the goal is for everybody to achieve that higher level of full Buddhahood, which is said to be possible and in fact is the main goal. Okay, and then the other thing that it said, so now we're on the fourth noble truth, of course, we're still on the third, the truth of cessation. So it said, so the other thing is that, why is cessation possible? The reason why cessation is possible is because you really can purify all of your negative bad habits. And the Buddha said so. And that brings us to the fourth way, which is the fourth noble truth, which is true path. And that's the Buddha said that there is a path to accomplish all of that. And that's mainly what the Buddha taught in all of his teachings, is this path. So there are meditational techniques. And again, everything in Buddhism is about transforming the mind, having these antidotes for all of the delusions. In the Mahayana path, there are also special techniques for purifying past negative karma, such as 35 confession Buddhas or Vajrasattva practice. And there are various ways for generate merit, which is really strongly emphasized in the Mahayana path. So there's various religious ceremonies, prayers, mandala offerings, all sorts of things, which the whole goal of which is to generate positive karma. And all of these are taught. In the the tradition of our center, which is a Tibetan center, this path is often called lamrim, which in Tibetan means stages of the path. And this was a way of, similar things exist in other types of Buddhism. In the Theravadan, the original Hinayana path, there's a book called The Path of Purification, the Visuddhimagga, which is again a similar thing where they try to take all of the teachings and organize it in a systematic way that makes it easy to practice the path, from sort of easy things to more difficult, more complex practices. In the Tibetan thing, it's lamrim. And the lamrim, the earliest texts that we have of lamrim were developed by Atisha, who was a scholar who came from India to Tibet around 1000 AD, when in the very early days of Buddhism in Tibet. And he sort of came across this in the beginning. He looked at the Tibetans and he was saying, you know, you guys are struggling, you know, some earlier people came that taught you Buddhism, but you're sort of all over the place. You need some help. And so he developed this lamrim thing as just a way of helping them, saying, okay, let me just lay out all of the practices in a systematic way so it makes it easier for you to practice the Buddhist path. Later on, about 400 years later, around 1400 AD, the head of the Gelugpa, the one who created the Gelug tradition in Tibet, Lama Tsongkhapa, who was an amazing reformer, he actually extended what Atisha had done into a much, much more detailed description. And so he wrote actually several different texts laying out this path. He did a short one so people wouldn't get bored and they could pick it up easily. He wrote sort of a middle-length version for people who had done the short one but wanted more details. And then he wrote a very long version called the Lamrim Chenmo, which laid out things in great detail. And an English translation, it comes actually in 3 volumes, which I've actually read the whole thing several times. And then for the Lamrim, there's actually an amazing set of books done by Geshe Sopa, who was a very high-level monk in Tibet. He sort of was around the time of the Dalai Lama. In fact, he was actually helped the Dalai Lama, the current Dalai Lama, prepared for himself to get his Geshe degree, sort of this PhD in Buddhism. He was considered to be one of the most learned Tibetan monks. He eventually came to America and actually became a full professor at the University of Wisconsin, and generated many different Western Buddhist professors, but just extraordinarily brilliant. And he wrote a series of books. Again, I forget, they're more like, instead of 3 volumes, they're more like 5 or 6 volumes, many of them very thick, where he gives detailed explanations of the lamrim, where he expands even more detail the things that Lama Tsongkhapa wrote. And to me, these 5 or 6 volumes are the most remarkable book in Buddhism I've ever read. Extraordinarily clear, explains everything. It's like having sort of a personal tutor sitting right next to you as you read these things. And so anyway, that explained. And actually, what I found is that after reading Geshe Sopa's texts, then it makes it very easy to go back to the original Lamrim, again in translation, of course, for us by Lama Tsongkhapa. And then actually, the original thing of Lama Tsongkhapa is fully understandable because you've had Geshe Sopa's commentary, and it actually is sort of nice because you can read it much quicker and sort of see the bigger picture more quickly. So anyway, that's what the Lamrim is. And what we're going to do for the rest of this course, which is mainly going to be next week because we're almost out of time, is we're going to go through a very short text written by Lama Tsongkhapa called The Foundation of All Good Qualities. You can write it down in maybe a page or 2. And we're going to go through that very quickly. So this full path to enlightenment, and we will discuss that. And I'm actually, when I taught this course earlier, they gave us more hours. I used to teach 5 classes of 2 hours each. So we had more time, 10 hours, and now we have 4 classes of 1.5 hours. So I only have 6 hours. So I have to compress. So I'm actually not going to read the text in this class, but essentially I will quickly go through all of that teachings. Many of the things I've already discussed in some ways, but I will just expand on these things. And then toward the end, I will also talk a little bit about the Tantric or Vajrayana path. And I will also talk about what the bodhicitta, what Mahayana Buddhism is about in the next class, and what makes it different and distinctive. And as I've said before in my earlier thing, it's really this Mahayana form, which is the vast majority of Buddhists today are Mahayana Buddhists, just because it just seemed to spread more easily than the Theravada, which is not to say, I mean, there's a lot of Theravada Buddhists in all over Sri Lanka, Thailand, that part of the world. And of course, a lot of them are now in the United States and in Europe also. So I think maybe what I should do is stop here, because this is a convenient point. And so next week I will go through lamrim. And again, I'm not going to have enough time to go through all of the details, but the idea will be just to carry you through the main points. And I think the critical thing is to see, especially to understand the difference between sort of the original path and understanding what the Mahayana path is. And in my mind, I actually see the Mahayana path as just sort of it's really continuous with the original Buddhist path. It's just that certain things are emphasized a little more strongly. I mean, the altruism certainly, and those aspects are more strongly emphasized in the Mahayana teachings, but they were certainly there in the original Hinayana teachings of the Buddha that lived around 500 BC. So, so I see, again, it's just sort of, it's the way that Buddhism always is. There are slight different emphases in slightly different practices, different things that you can do. And I think it's, different people need different things. So different people are attracted to different aspects, and whatever you need, whatever works for you is where you should go. The other thing I will talk a little bit about is an important notion called emptiness. In the original Buddhism, it tended to be called more selflessness, non-Atman, if you like. So that's, again, the non-Atman strongly distinguishes Buddhism from Hinduism, for example. But I will also go into that. And okay, so I think that's sort of the main idea. Let me just stop and see if there's any questions. We still got a couple minutes.
Yeah, one that I always find confusing is like we all have a Buddha nature. And yeah. Okay, done. That's good. Now, it looks like Buddha, the historical Buddha, went from being a human being. He wasn't an arhat, or was he? Or I'm confused about that part, because is it like a progression? You become an arhat and then you later become a Buddha? How does this? I'm not clear on this one.
Yeah, that's yeah. I mean, that's the trickiness of when we went to the Mahayana Buddhists. We introduced another level. And actually, you can do both together or separately. I mean, the original goal that the Buddha taught in 500 BC was really to become an arhat, to liberate yourself from samsara, to get rid of your suffering. But the Buddha at that time also talked about himself being a bodhisattva. And for living the spiritual life for a much longer period of time, to purify himself even more completely. And it's a little bit tricky because, in a certain sense, the arhats have purified themselves of all of the, obvious negativities of their mind. They are pure beings. However, there's something that somehow the Buddha is slightly more pure. And it's said that there are two types of obstructions to full enlightenment. So there's sort of the lower level obstructions, which are getting rid of the kleshas, which is what the arhats do. But then there's said that there are obstructions to omniscience, which is sort of a higher level of purification, which is what you need to become a full Buddha. And it's because the full Buddha has removed these very, very extremely subtle obstructions that he has full omniscience and higher powers. However, these obstructions to omniscience, in a sense, almost don't exist. And the analogy they give, I'll give you the analogy. It's actually hard to understand, but they say, like, take a closed box, put some garlic in it, maybe a wooden box, put some garlic in it, keep it tightly closed for a week or so, take off the lid and remove the garlic. After you remove the garlic symbolizes the kleshas, the negativities, and more precisely the underlying tendencies to these kleshas, meaning that once you destroy these things, the kleshas can never arise ever again. So you remove the garlic, but what's left over, if you go to the box and you sniff it, you can still smell, there's a little bit of a garlic smell left over. In the analogy, those are what the obstructions to omniscience are. So I don't know, in a sense, there's sort of nothing there. There's this very subtle smell, but it's those removing that smell, which is the final purification that takes you to full Buddhahood. And the other point of view, of course, is that the difference is that in the original form of Buddhism, when you became an arhat, whenever it was that you died, then at that point, you were never again reborn in samsara. So you sort of disappeared out of samsara. And in the Mahayana Buddhism, what they say happens is that these arhats choose to continue to be reborn in samsara, even though they don't have to be reborn. They deliberately choose to be reborn in samsara so that they have the additional time to purify these obstructions to omniscience, and so that they can achieve full Buddhahood. And as we'll see from the motivation, this is done so they can help, for an altruistic motivation, so they can help other people on the spiritual path. So in the Mahayana Buddhist, you can be an arhat, but still continue to be reborn in samsara. And of course, if you are reborn in samsara, you don't really have to worry about all the normal suffering of samsara or whatever. So it's a little bit tricky. I don't know if that's helpful.
It definitely is helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
The
garlic and garlic scent analogy is good. I get that.
Okay. Yeah. So it's a little bit tricky because, when you remove the remove the garlic, that is the ostensibly visible negativities, but there's still, I don't know, just something, a hint, a whiff, something like that that's left over that you still need to purify. And even the Hinayana Buddhists, the Theravadas, they're very upfront about the fact that there was something special about the Buddha. The Buddha was definitely at a higher spiritual level than just an ordinary arhat, even though that was the original goal that the living Buddha 500 BC taught. So, but on the other hand, the living Buddha 500 BC taught about himself as a bodhisattva. And I think those are the things that the Mahayanas picked up on, saying that why shouldn't we shoot for a higher level to become full Buddhas? And of course, to understand this, you have to understand bodhicitta, this altruistic motivation, which I will do next week in more detail. But so anyway, at these very high levels, it can be we're just ordinary human beings. And so I think it's difficult for us to really understand what happens at these very high levels. Yeah. But anyway, I'm telling you what they say.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. I've got another question, but it's not at all applicable for this class. So I'm wondering if I could maybe ask you afterward, if that's possible.
Okay. So I will sign off. If I can stop the recording, actually, which I will do, and then we can continue to talk. So this is officially the end of Buddhism as a Nutshell, the third class.